Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a yoga teacher at the advanced 500-hour level. I am a kirtan artist, musician, and amongst other things. And today I wanted to talk about the lotus, and the lotus as a metaphor, but also as a map for enlightenment. Before I get into the talk today, though, I did want to thank the community that makes these talks possible. And those are my patrons on Patreon. They make a monthly contribution, which allows me to set aside the time, the energy, the resources to make these videos public without any kind of a paywall, which is how I like to work. Kind of old school spirituality, where people who find value and want to share this teaching, they contribute to make that possible, like tithing at a church. So if you are interested in joining that community, check out the links below. And other ways you can help out is making a one-time donation, buying merch. There is a QR code at the beginning and end of the videos. And of course, liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting if you're on YouTube. All right, so the lotus as not just a metaphor for enlightenment, but actually a map that we can use for enlightenment. So the lotus, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a beautiful flower, and it floats on the surface of like a pond or a lake. However, what you may not realize is the roots are down in the muck, the mud at the bottom of the lake or the pond. And I don't know about you, if you've ever stepped foot in a pond or a lake. I grew up with, my parents had a country house on a lake. And when you stepped in the lake, it was full of muck. So it's not like walking into a beach or something like that. There's just muck down there. It's very soft. And there are things like bloodsuckers and creatures that live down in that muck. And you could come out of the muck easily with all kinds of things like bloodsuckers attached to your legs. So most people aren't going to enjoy stepping foot in that kind of environment. And yet that's where the lotus has its roots. So this is a powerful metaphor teaching. So here is the map. The mud is your life's challenges. You could say it's dukkha, it's suffering, it's all the stuff you don't like about your life. All the stuff that you would rather change about yourself and the world and all this stuff, right? And I'd say we all have that stuff. And most of us wish we could wave a wand and make it go away. However, if you understand this teaching, then you understand that that muck and mud is actually the fuel for your enlightenment. So in a sense, you don't want it to go away. This might be one reason why Jesus said that it was harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. I'm reading that as becoming enlightened, right? Entering nirvana, entering the state where one is experiencing the kingdom of heaven upon the earth, where most people don't see it. So he said it's harder for a rich person to do that than it is for a camel to thread a needle, the eye of a needle. Now, I've heard all kinds of different interpretations about this, but the way I'm taking it here is if life is too good, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying rich people don't have their own challenges, and I don't think that's what Jesus was saying, but I think he was trying to teach something there. If life is too good, too easy, if we get complacent because we don't have challenges, then we can't enter the kingdom of heaven. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible. Okay, so I think that this is what we're pointing to here. So what is the mud in this metaphor, in this map? The mud is your life challenges, all the traumas, all the insults, all the unfairness that you think is out there in the world. That is your mud. The water, I believe, represents the unconscious. And I learned this from Joseph Campbell, who I believe learned it from Jung, that in these old scriptures and texts and myths, water is usually representing the unconscious, okay? So we have our conscious mind that we're aware of, but science tells us that the unconscious rules about 95% of our decision making throughout the day. So it's really running the show for the most part. And then the lotus represents enlightenment. Okay, you could say the goal of a spiritual path. I don't even know if goal is the right word. You could say maybe the inevitability of a spiritual path. So that's the map. What is this map trying to teach us, or what is it trying to communicate? What is it trying to tell us? Well, I think it's saying we must take root in life's challenges. Most of us, when we're faced with a challenge, we want to avoid it. We want to resolve it. We want to get rid of it. We don't see it as fuel for something, for growth, for enlightenment. We just like, oh my God, I got fired. You know, it's unfair. I don't like it. Or I got dumped. It's not fair. I don't like it. Why me? All these kinds of things. And one thing I've learned from the teachers that I've studied with is this isn't a very helpful attitude. I would say in any regard, not just spiritually speaking, it's just not a helpful attitude. Why me? It's unfair. I don't deserve this. That just doesn't really get you anywhere. It's just complaining, you could say, and it doesn't improve anything. Whereas if you can take a different attitude, then we can use life's challenges to grow and to improve in many, many ways. So that's what we're trying to learn to do. So taking root in life's challenges, taking root in the mud, not trying to escape or get away from it. Then I think the second part of that is, if we look at the lotus, it takes root in the mud, but then it moves through the water. It grows, the stem goes through the water up toward the surface. And the way I'm interpreting this is the water, again, is the unconscious. And it's telling us that we must move through the unconscious, that the unconscious isn't something we can avoid or go around. It's something that must be moved through. So our roots are in the mud, and we move through the unconscious to get to the surface, to enlightenment. And then enlightenment, of course, is the flower that's floating on the top of the water, and it opens itself up to the light, the sunlight, right? So this is the map, the way I'm seeing it, the way I'm interpreting it. And I think the next question is, what does this look like in practice? Now, I've talked a lot about ways to do these different steps, but I'm just going to summarize here. So if you want more detail, you can watch other videos, or you can reach out to me. You can leave a comment. I'll try and explain things maybe a little more clearly, but hopefully this will be enough for you. So the mud, I would say this is accepting life's challenges. And the quote I'm going to use is one I've used before from Muso Soseki. If you forget your feelings about worldly things, they become enlightened teachings. So what this means is, if I get attached to things of the world, if I try and avoid things in the world, then they bind me to the world. They keep me from enlightenment. I stay in the mud. But if I forget my feelings about things of the world, the challenges, the likes, the dislikes, I just accept them. I detach from them. I see them as an inevitable consequence, or an alternative is to see them as a consequence of what is often taught in Eastern traditions as karma. So all the things I don't like, I simply see as a result of my poor choices or behavior in the past. And I just sort of accept that's in the present moment's inevitable. I can't avoid it. That is what's going on. And so I just accept that. So accepting life's challenges, and to remember that it actually is the mud that feeds enlightenment. It's the mud that feeds the flower. So once again, if we think about what Jesus said, then maybe someone who doesn't have much mud in their life, they don't really have what it takes to be enlightened in this lifetime. Now, I'm not going to say that that is an absolute truth, but it could very well be a relative truth. I find in my own community, the people I teach, very often these are people who are struggling with something in some way. Very often people come to the path and get serious about it when they've experienced some kind of struggle or trauma. Okay, so it tends to be rare that someone is doing great and they step on the path in a serious way. Sometimes in modern times, people will pick up a path and do what's called spiritual materialism, where it's cool to be a Buddhist or it's cool to be a yogi. And so they'll buy all the right clothes and they'll put all the right quotes on their socials and they will try and appear very spiritual, but they're not actually interested in getting in the mud. They're not actually interested in getting dirty. And I actually like that. I just thought of it right now, but don't be afraid to get dirty, right? We so often are trying to control everything in our life, trying to control everything. And I think to really progress on the path, we have to we have to get dirty. We have to be willing to get in that mud and that muck of our life. So that's what feeds our enlightenment. And so in a sense, instead of getting upset about the troubles in your life, woe is me, I got fired, woe is me, I'm not making as much money as I like, use it. Use the mud. Use the mud for fuel. Okay, in Zen, there's a saying, turning weeds into fertilizer. How do I take the stuff I don't like, the stuff I want to throw away, and actually turn it into fuel, right? So again, detachment of feelings. If I detach from my feelings about things of the world, they become enlightened teachings. Okay, the water. Bring awareness to the body and to the mind. Thoughts are simply images and words or voices that are in your head. That's all they are. Now, they can be strung together in a way that creates a narrative or story. So you could create a little story in your mind, or you can create a little movie in your mind. But that's really all that thoughts are. So we might think thoughts are this amazing thing, this or that or the other thing, but thoughts are just words or images or a voice that appears in our head that we can listen to or we can watch. And that's really all that it is. All right? Emotions are simply contractions that are felt in the viscera of the body. Now, these can be in response to something I'm seeing happening in real time, or it can be in response to my thoughts and images that appear in my mind, right? So again, the words or thoughts or story, or often an interpretation of events happening in the world. So again, I might interpret something in a way that is upsetting, even though my interpretation isn't correct. I will still feel the negative emotion regardless of facts or truth or anything like that. So my advice is begin to observe these objectively. So what does that mean? See them as objects appearing in the field of awareness. We usually attach to them and we get thrown by them. So I have a certain emotion, let's call it loneliness. So then I say, I'm lonely, and I tell myself the story about how I'm lonely, and then I go and I start looking for friends or a partner or whatever it is. Now, I don't want to paint emotions as like evil or bad or that you should ignore them, but a certain amount of detachment and awareness needs to be cultivated when it comes to our thoughts and emotions, because I don't care who you are, not every thought you think is true or helpful, and the same is also true of your emotions. Not every time you feel a certain emotion does that mean you should act on that emotion. So I can feel emotions that tell me to do certain things that would actually be quite detrimental. So I might, again, get very upset and feel like punching my superior at work. That doesn't mean that's a good idea. So many of us, we tend to listen to our thoughts and our emotions more than really is helpful, because a lot of times the narrative and the emotions that might go with them or might cause the narrative, these very often are unskillful and unhelpful ultimately. So until we create some space between ourselves, the big self, and these motivators, you might say, that we could call part of the ego complex, then we will identify with them. That's what Patanjali tells us in the Yoga Sutras, that until we calm and harmonize the mind, the heart-mind, we will identify with the heart-mind, so thoughts, emotions, and that isn't really what we would call enlightenment. Okay? So start to observe them, see them as objects in awareness, stop reacting or letting them motivate you. Now again, this is not a blanket, always, all time. This is setting aside time to do this, to just observe. And usually that time is called meditation, like a seated meditation, where you can take time and observe what is arising in the field of awareness. The thoughts, the emotions, the impulses, the desires, the fears, observing all this as though you're studying someone else's mind. All right, so again, not getting wrapped up in the story, not sitting there meditating, thinking about someone who wronged you, and then getting up off your cushion and saying, well, okay, I'm going to go get revenge now because I'm so upset. This isn't really what we want to do. So over time, as Patanjali tells us that yoga is the calming, the harmonizing of the chitta vrittis, the movements, the waves in the heart-mind, what I've learned is that if over time you just observe the thoughts, the images, the voices, the emotions, they will begin to become more and more still. They will get more and more quiet. There'll be more space between them. And eventually, you could say, the heart-mind begins to reflect reality perfectly. So it's not distorted by these waves. And again, we can equate the waves with the ego to some degree. And then finally we have the lotus. So enlightenment is the awareness of our true nature. It's only by getting out of your personal story, by detaching from circumstances, and then bringing awareness to the objects in awareness, that we eventually free ourselves and rest in our true nature, which is the metaphor of floating on the surface of the water as the flower. Okay, so this is how I read that teaching. I'm sure other teachers and other people maybe have a different way of interpreting it, but this is my current way of looking at that teaching and using that teaching as a map for enlightenment. And I try to give you some actionable steps. If you're new here, or maybe you're new to spirituality, or you haven't listened to many of my talks, again, it may still sound vague, but people who are students of mine who have been studying with me for a while, who've watched many videos, they probably have a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. Getting into seated meditation, letting go of the suffering, right? The story of, woe is me, it's not fair, you know, I don't like this, I don't like the way I feel. And then diving into the unconscious. The unconscious shows up in the body. It shows up in the body. So again, those emotions, those contractions, the way we respond to life is really a type of story that is probably out of our awareness. We don't even know we're telling ourselves that story. Moving through the unconscious, so that's that part, and then eventually arising into enlightenment, where we can bask in the light of our true nature, of awareness, what we could say the sunlight at the surface. We're floating on top of all that unconsciousness, and we have our roots in the challenges of a human life. I sometimes say there's no such thing as an easy human life. We might think that someone with a lot of money or success or other things doesn't have challenges, but we all have challenges. And if we want, if we're motivated to, we can use those to grow our lotus of enlightenment. All right, everyone, as usual, I hope you got a lot from this teaching. And if you did, again, you can help out by liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting, as well as perhaps making a one-time donation, becoming a patron, or buying some merch. Until next time, namaste, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.